Okay, good afternoon, everybody out there, and good day, good morning to, or good evening to people listening in from abroad. Welcome to this, the third. Good day, good morning to, or good evening to people listening in from abroad. Welcome to this, the third. Good day, good morning to, or good evening to people. Sorry, apologies for that technical issue. Welcome to this, the third of the Access Habitable Planet online course live event sessions. And this is the session, the third and final one of our with probably the most interesting and should I say, most controversial bit of the course. We are now thinking about humans and climate change. And I have with me today a very distinguished panel who are going to hopefully try and make sense of these difficult issues with you. As always, I'm going to ask the panel to give a quick introduction to themselves, and I'm going to ask them to do so with one of the questions that we've received from you, the iPlaneteers, the young South Africans who are currently involved in our online course. And so the question that we're going to use today is, I'd like to ask each of our panel members to please give a short introduction to yourself, and then ask Neliswe's question, which is, what makes science fun for you? I'll start here in the room. To my left, Professor Mike.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Lucas. I'm a biological oceanographer, and I've spent much of my life at sea on ships throughout the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and down to the Southern Ocean several times. And my interest is really looking at the role of the oceans in climate change. And I guess what's really fascinated me over the last decade or so is just being at sea and making sort of
It looks like they've gone down. Let's hope they come back shortly.
We're here. Sorry, carry on.
Good.
In terms of the big kick I've had has been obviously spending my life at sea. It's not for everyone, I suppose, but being out on a ship with a bunch of enthusiastic young people making new discoveries about how the ocean works and how it affects the climate has been a real highlight of my career.
Nice one. Thank you, Mike. To my right-hand side, we have long-term planeteer, Basanda Nondlazi. Basanda, tell us something about yourself.
Yes, I'm still Basanda Nondlazi, and I am an ecologist, plant ecologist, and my interests are in vegetation distribution and assemblage. I love science because when we go to work, we don't have to wear uniform or be formal. It's quite a relaxed environment. And what makes it fun for me is that collaboration is encouraged, actually. You not just sit in your office and do your work and that's it. You are encouraged to work with other people from abroad, from across the country, from different fields. So that's what I love about it.
Nice one. Thanks, Basanda. Going to those that we have joining us from a distance. Science fun for you?
Me?
Wendy, ladies first.
Sorry, okay, go in.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy. I am an archaeologist specializing in bioarchaeology, so the study of human remains. I'm also the curator of archaeology at Iziko Museums of South Africa, which is based in Cape Town. And what I love about science is the discovery that what we know today is a speck of what we can know in the future. And it's a very exciting discovery and journey. Oh, it's me.
Nice one. Thank you very much, Wendy. That actually completes our panel for the time being. We may still well have a couple of panelists join. Oh, sorry, Neville. Neville, sorry, please introduce yourself.
I'm quite a forgettable guy, but nevertheless.
He's only the director of the program.
I'm Neville Sweijd. I am at Access with Carl, and I have a background in marine science and marine biology, in fact, in molecular genetics. At least my PhD was on molecular genetics. So, but I've been a science manager for a long time, and now my current interest is in climate and its impact on health. So I have a broad interest, and I'm very lucky in my job to have a kind of bird's eye view of science in general, because I get to work with a whole range of different scientists in Earth system science. Carl, you guys have disappeared again, but I can see Wendy. And I know that Guy Midgley is going to join us again shortly because he's also had some technical problems. But while they come back to us from Rosebank, let me just say why I enjoy science. Well, largely for the reason I've just said, because I'm in the privileged position of really seeing a whole range of different kinds of science, from quite basic science right through to applied science. And to see science in action is really exciting and very interesting. And the other thing I like about science is that it's actually very creative. It gives you an opportunity to be creative, both in terms of, so science is not hard as people imagine it is, or very technical. I mean, it can be, but beyond that, it's also very creative in the kinds of ideas you have, the theories you test, and the way you represent what it is that you're trying to show. So science provides with a lot of interest. And also, it's been a fantastic opportunity and career. So that's my view on it.
Nice one. Thank you, Neville. And as it will become apparent, we appear to have connection issues here in Rosebank. If they continue, Neville, I'm just going to have to ask that you fill in while we are away. I'll try and press on nonetheless and make the best of it. So, for those joining us late, welcome again. I've just introduced our panel. We have amongst us a human evolution specialist, a geneticist, some ocean scientists, a botanist here. And we're hoping that we'll maybe be joined with some others. It's time to, for everyone out there, I'm sure a lot of you will be focused on the big news of the day. But I want to tell you that Joe Root's 100 in India is not that exciting, even though it is the biggest score by a batsman on day one in India for nearly a decade. But other than that, let's not get sidetracked with current affairs. Let's head straight into the science. Oh, one last thing before we do so. I want to quickly announce something for the students joining us who are on our online course. That, as you'll know, there's about 100 students still participating in the course across the country. And each week they're taking exams. And the top 25 of those, and a few extras, 25 to 30, will be coming to a workshop in Cape Town. Professor Mike Lucas on my left here has made the very kind offer if you could model your book. He recently has a book on climate change out. He is going to offer a signed copy to whichever student comes top of the online exams. So next week, when we've had the final exam, Mike will be making it out specifically to whoever is top and sending that off. So thank you very much, Mike. That's lovely. As we don't have Guy yet, I'm going to stick with the order. So we've been doing the Habitable Planet online course. We have students out there who have been studying the reasons why planet Earth is habitable for about nearly 10 weeks now. So we started a long time ago, 10 weeks ago. And we've been slowly investigating the various different factors which go into making planet Earth habitable. I have our little scheme up here that the students will be very familiar with. And I just want to very quickly place where we are. Because many people won't remember all that way back, that if we go right back to the start of the course, we started with this really fascinating observation that we now know more than 10,000 planets in the solar system, but of those 10,000 planets, we only know one of them that's habitable. That's quite a remarkable fact. And so for the last 10 weeks, we've been slowly trying to dissect that and understand why that is. And we went through all of that time ago. We had Sarah give our first of our core lectures looking at this bare rock model. So where Sarah said, well, you know, Venus is too hot. Lose 10 points. Venus is too hot. Mars is too cold. Maybe Earth is just the right distance from the sun to be habitable. And it turned out that if we strip away all of the complexity and just have a bare ball of rock at a given distance from the sun, Earth will be far too cold. And since then, what we've been doing is we've been augmenting, we've been adding to this bare ball of rock model one thing at a time to try and investigate what the effect of that is. So we added an atmosphere and an ocean that were static, and we found that we'd have a planet that was too hot. So then we made the move. We added weather and climate. We added paleo perspective. We looked at the effects of ice ages and how the planet is continually dynamic. We added life, and we just came to the strange revelation that you can't explain why Earth is habitable without life itself. We've now come, I don't know if you can see because on my screen it's a little bit below the marker. We now come to this section at the bottom on humans. And so what we do in this last section is we augment our model, which just had an Earth without humans, by adding in humans and all of the complications that they bring. And humans, it turns out, adds a completely different dimension to this model. You can't model people, so you don't know, nobody could build a computer model capable of predicting what word will end my sentence, green, and then nobody can predict hundreds of people. So if you can't predict one, you can't even predict hundreds. So we can't model this, we have to use conceptual models, and we'll be using some of those later on today. But firstly, what we're going to do is we're going to think about how is it that humans came to be here on the Earth in the first place. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Wendy now. Wendy, I'd just like to request just a 2 to 3 minute summary on human evolution. What happened? Why did it happen? How did humans end up on this Earth? And in doing so, we had a question from Fenyo, who wanted more clarity about the idea of evolving from monkeys. So I think if you could cover that, that would be appreciated.
Okay, human evolution in 3 minutes, that's quite a challenge. So when we talk about evolution, we talk about natural selection, which is really the key to understanding the distribution of all animals across the globe, but particularly for us, important today, are humans. So we're looking at the change through time of, so how did we change in structure or form or habits or behavior that led to the species or the phenotype that we see today. How we got here? Well, it all started about 6 to 7 million years ago when we decided, we being our ancestors, decided to come down from the trees because of an environmental shift. So trees started to deplete and these species needed to survive. As the environment started to become this savanna type environment, our ancestors had to adapt in order to survive. So we start seeing morphological or physical changes in species over the last, you could argue, 6 million years. So in order to answer Fenyo, who asks about evolving from monkeys, we didn't really evolve from monkeys. We do share a common ancestor many, many, many million years ago. So we share some traits, some genetic material with disease, but the split happened a long time ago and we went onto our own lineage with our own evolutionary track. And that's how we ended up, in a nutshell, here today.
Nice one. Thank you, Wendy. And also quite nicely that you've broken that down into two sections. So we had firstly the general bit about what evolution is, and then secondly the bit about how human evolution specifically happened. I'm going to follow those sections with the student questions. So we're going to do firstly those ones that fall really into genuinely understanding what evolution is, and then move on to specifically the ones on human evolution. I'm going to start with we had some similar questions from Samke and Nadumelo. Samke asks, what drives the evolution of new species? And Nadumelo asks, how fast do species evolve? Neville, you want to give us something about that, please?
Thanks. I would like to draw when I talk to illustrate some things, but I can't. So I'm going to ask you to use your imaginations when I describe things. But the point I want to make is that we have to first understand the concept of time. Carl, you need to flip images because Wendy's showing. Okay, so a huge amount of time has passed, and that humans as a species, as we recognize as modern humans, have only existed in a short period of time. Some species have remained relatively unchanged for a long time, whereas other species have changed at a greater rate. It has to do with what the pressures are for change, what the pressures are for adaptation to different and changes in environment. So there's an ecological driver. Let me be quite specific. Evolution happens by accident, and that's an accident of mutation. So what you've got to imagine is that there are a series of individuals that make up a population of a particular species. Guy, you need to mute your microphone. And so those individuals exist in a particular population of that particular species. All interbreeding and the genes are mixing up. There might be some individuals in that particular population which have an advantage over other individuals. It could be wing length, it could be something physiological, it could be any characteristic which gives that animal the advantage, the competitive advantage over another individual in that particular group of animals. And so because they have that advantage, so they breed better, they have stronger offspring, and those offspring survive more than, because they have this advantage, more than other individuals in that particular population. And so over generations, those individuals that have that particular genetic mutation, which affords them that particular advantage, so they start to dominate. And that particular characteristic then is bred into the population. It's like selective breeding of dogs. If we are dog keepers, we want dogs that have a louder bark or run faster, as the case may be. So we're selecting that particular trait actively. So in nature, that particular trait is selected by natural selection rather than by directed selection of humans. We do it with plants, we do it with all sorts of things in a directed way. In nature, it's natural selection. And when that particular characteristic, which is ultimately coded for genetically, becomes manifest, becomes more dominant in the population, so that genetic trait is more common. Now, how do animals speciate? That's the next question. Well, we have separation of different populations of one species. There might be, let's just take, for example, baboons that happen to live in Table Mountain with baboons that happen to live in Stellenbosch, and the breeding between those, in other words, genetic flow between those populations is blocked by some barrier. And so what we have is a process called genetic drift, where you see populations start to differentiate from each other genetically because they're genetically isolated. And over time, over long periods of time, and over generations, so these populations start to look different genetically and phenotypically. They start to look different. And when they are different enough, there comes a point where we can start to say, well, these are either different, if you like, races of that population, or they are different species of that population. Eventually we get to a point where we have different species. And so, for example, we have the bulbul, which is a bird. And if you go around the country, you'll see they're all one species, but the bulbuls are defined in terms of different races of bulbul. Some have red eyes, some have black eyes. They can interbreed, they're still one species, but they are genetically distinct from each other because they have genetically, phenotypically different characteristics. So where we draw the line between species and population is quite a difficult one to define. The rate at which populations develop different genetic differences varies tremendously between the environments in which they live. Marine organisms, which live in a fairly regulated environment compared to, say, terrestrial organisms, which live in a very much more varied environment, the pressure to change is much greater on land than at sea. So we see much slower evolution. Also, some genes are highly conserved. So, for example, the RNA replication genetic system is very common between even bacteria and humans. They are conserved genes, whereas other genes, like those you find in the mitochondrial DNA, those change very, very quickly. So the rate of change of different genetic systems within organisms, also some are conserved and some are not. One more point I want to add. I said at the beginning that the driver of all of this is effectively random accidental mutation. So the fact is mutations happen all the time. Mutations happen within the lifetime of one individual species. I have mutations from when I was born. Some of my cells have mutations. But what happens is most of those mutations are not passed on to the next generation. When mutations do occur, the majority of mutations do not confer any genetic advantage on an individual species. Most of genetic mutations are either neutral, they have no impact, or they are deleterious. In other words, they confer a disadvantage. Most mutations, because they are random, actually either kill the organism, otherwise it's not born, or it's stillborn, or they are simply of no genetic value, or they confer a disadvantage, and so they're not bred into the population. Only
but
those
mutations.
Yes.
Just to jump in, just a question. But neutral mutations will still get passed on, right? Because they don't inhibit that individual from reproducing.
Yes. But the point is, because they confer no advantage, they don't get breeded into the population. They don't get expressed as a reproductive advantage. So, for example, for all of us, we have different genes. Each individual is genetically different from the next individual, right? But those can get passed on quite normally between different populations. It's only those genes that confer a particular advantage at a particular time that environmentally suits that species to perform better. So it can get more food, it can run away from predators faster, it can breed better, whatever the advantage is. As long as it confers an advantage, that is the agency of the positive change. The majority of mutations are negative or neutral. One example I'll give you of that. I'm Jewish, and because Jewish people tend to marry other Jewish people, it means that whatever genes are in that population stay within that population. So it's quite an isolated group. That's not true anymore. Most Jewish people breed out these days. But nevertheless, there's a disease called Tay-Sachs disease. And that disease is really a disease that stays within the Jewish population because they're inbreeding in the sense that Jews are marrying other Jews. And so that particular gene, which is a recessive gene, that brings up a whole another set of issues, that's a recessive gene, it gets passed on more. If there weren't an isolated population, we'd be bred out. And so the Jewish people retain that gene. And so Tay-Sachs disease is really a Jewish disease, as an example, because of the way people behave, because of the kind of breeding patterns. So to summarize, bottom line is that all genetics, evolution is the result of a genetic mutation of those characteristics which are expressed as phenotypic characteristics which interact with the environment. Those that give an advantage to individuals will see that the frequency of those genetic mutations increase in the population over generations, which will accumulate in that population to make that population drift away from the mainstream, assuming it's isolated. So that gene pool of that isolated population then becomes distinct from the rest of the population to a point that we can define that as a different species which can no longer breed with the original species. It's a long-winded answer, but I hope that describes it well enough.
No, that's great, Neville. And also, I think that's gone quite a way to answering some of the other students' question. There was one that you haven't got to, though, which was Samke asked as to whether there's ever an end point to evolution.
I'm happy to answer that one, but then I'll ask that others, including Wendy, who might know more than me about this, also answers it and adds to what I've said, or disagrees, as the case may be. So the answer is no. Evolution is an ongoing process. Human evolution is quite complicated. I want to quickly tell a story. I met a geneticist who worked in Nottingham, and he was saying to me that in the past, the way people in England, in villages, the way people met and married other people was radially away from their village. So this was the village, then they would have an equal chance of marrying and breeding with people across radially from that village. But then the railways came in, and the railways connected villages along a linear line of railway. And so people started changing the breeding pattern. Instead of marrying radially, started marrying along the railway lines. And so what I'm trying to illustrate with that example is that the way we meet and marry people in the modern era is changed the way evolution is happening amongst humans. The isolation of populations has changed. Because we are mobile and we move around, the way we spread our genes across the planet has changed enormously. That's the one thing. And the second thing is, what is a selective advantage in human populations? So in some societies, being wealthy is a genetic advantage. In some societies, being poor creates more children, so there's more gene spread, as an example. So I know these things get quite complicated. Socioeconomics, social status, wealth, poverty, all of these social and political issues change the way in which humans evolve. So the way humans are evolving is changing enormously, has changed enormously, especially with globalization. But in other populations, there are other pressures. For example, in fisheries, this is my last example, in fisheries, there's this very interesting concept. When fisheries started, we of course are one of the last populations where we're actually hunting. Fishing is like hunting. We are catching animals from a wild population. And we go for the big fish, right, which are usually the more fecund fish, the fish that produce more babies, are the bigger ones. So we go for all the big fish, and suddenly it becomes a disadvantage to be big. Because if you're big, you're going to get caught. So what's happening is there's a genetic influence of fishing on fish populations. And we're starting to see that they've been reaching an age of maturity much earlier than they used to in the past. That is seen as some sort of adaptation to fishing pressure. So we can see that where there's intervention and natural systems are perturbed, we can already see some genetic changes in those populations. But on the whole, there's still genetic pressures. There's still natural selection.
So, Neville, would it be fair to say that, therefore, what we're witnessing is actually evidence of evolution happening? The fish are evolving to be smaller. Well,
it's a debate about whether that's a genetic shift or that's an ecological shift. But either way, the evidence is there that there is genetic change in a population from what it was to what it is today. That's one example. There are several others, yes.
Wendy, I fear that your answer to this is going to involve the future evolution of humans, and I want to come to that later. But do you have anything not to do with humans to say on the topic?
Yeah, I can maybe give a summary in a sentence or two what Neville was talking about.
Okay.
Some of the rate question species. Organisms, the same species, will adapt in different ways to better exploit a diverse environment or specific resources. different rates. And these groups or populations become so different, no longer breed or mate together, separate species, or forming these separate species.
Okay, nice one. Thank you, Wendy. That's a lovely summary. I'm going to move on to the last one in this section, or the last section of questions. Asive asks the question, and I'll read it exactly as Asive wrote. Dr. Carl, do you believe in evolution? Asive, I'm glad you've asked that because it's one of my favorite questions to answer. I will try and answer as succinctly as possible. I'd like to contend that there's definitely no belief required in evolution. I don't consider myself as someone who believes in evolution. But what I do, I suppose, maybe believe in is the validity of the scientific method. But I would argue that I believe in it with good reason. So really, the scientific method is a way of knowing about the world, and I would argue that it's distinguished above any other way of knowing about the world, specifically because of its ability to deliver progress. So we're looking back to the 16th century. We have the scientific method involved in making observations, generalizing into a theory, and then testing that theory with new observations. That cycle of thinking has produced the modern world, from cars to computers to spacecraft, from Newton's law of gravity, Einstein's relativity, all the way to the discovery of DNA. It's that cycle of empirical observation in order to build and test theories. So I believe that that works because it has delivered the modern world. If you use that cycle of making observations and building a theory, there is no other theory to explain why we have the millions and millions of species on Earth that we do. It's the only one out there. There's nothing else competing with it. And so if you want to know, using the scientific method, why are there lots and lots of different species? How can we explain the fossil record? How can we explain how all these species have come to be adapted to their niche? There is only one possible option out there right now. If a better theory came along that explained the observations better, I would totally look at it and I would switch straight away. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that. It's quite an emotive topic. Neville, you can go for it.
Yes, I wanted to say that there are three big persistent issues in the world that people continuously argue about. One is abortion, the other is hanging, death penalty, and the third is evolution. Okay, and these become quite complex and almost cultural and religious in their debate. And I want to address the issue of this idea that believing in God and believing in evolution, to use a phrase, each other. And I want to argue that they are not. And that many, many people, and we've encountered this a lot in Habitable Planet, that many, many people are taught early in life that evolution is a theory which is anti-religious, and that teaching evolution is going against the word of God. And I want to address that head on because I fear that people are not thinking independently. And what I want to say about that is that, in my view, whether or not you believe in God does not, and believe that God created the world and created the species, does not necessarily have to impact on your understanding of evolution and of science. Because one way or another, there needs to be a mechanism of creation. And the mechanism of evolution is one explanation for how this happens, which does not exclude or preclude God. And I'm not telling you what my views are, because I have a particular view on this issue, which I'm putting aside. I'm not going to say what I believe. I'm trying to state the fact that these are not incompatible issues. They're not incompatible approaches to life. And that we don't have to look at evolution as something threatening, even if we are religious and believe in creation. So that's just one view I wanted to purport.
Okay, thanks, Neville. That leads quite nicely. And Tombi asks, can one say that evolution is the process of where species keep on changing, but just as an adjustment to what God has created. So I think that's the idea of theistic evolution, right?
You're asking me, again, I'm not going to take a position on the religious aspects of this, but what I want to say is that we have, as Wendy explained, a very diverse environment, and we have very many different types of forms of life existing in this very diverse environment. And adaptation is a process which is ultimately genetic, or within the range of genetic options that are in a population, that ensure that organisms are adapted to that environment, develop in that environment, or adapt to changes in that environment. And whether you want to believe that is created, or whether you believe it happens independently of creation, is secondary to the actual facts of how organisms adapt to the environment. So whether it's created or not created, or what the mechanism is of creation, I think is a secondary debate. But the answer is yes.
Okay, can I come in on that?
Go ahead, Guy.
Well, I mean, I think there's a very cogent argument to be made that that any notion of God is created by people, because it just makes no sense that for billions of years this Earth floated around, before humans were on it, that the universe is so large. Why do we even need a God? It's only when people reach a certain level of intelligence, enough intelligence to know that they were alive, but not enough intelligence to be able to put together a scientific explanation for why things have happened, that the need for a God arose. And that's, you can make a very cogent argument that God is created in the image of people. So I stand quite strongly on this. I think one's fundamental position should be that there is no God, and that there is no evidence to support a God. And in fact, so many bad things flow from people's belief in a divine creator that you could argue that it's caused more damage than anything. So yeah, I stand quite strongly on that point.
I think that it's fair to think that way, but I think where you look for the evidence, and you look for the evidence in a scientific way, when you're talking about the religious matter, is in itself flawed. Because if you're going to start questioning issues of God, then you're going into a religious affair, and you must use religious means. As in science, you wouldn't allow a person to come and use religious ideas in science. So it should not be that when you're doing a religious inquiry, you use a scientific method, but you should use a religious method. And there you are invited. If you're looking for God in a religious manner, then there you are invited. You can do that, and there are ways, and you can even ask me.
I use science to look at why people pray. There's an area in the brain which is stimulated by prayer. Science has looked at religion in many different ways, and the role for God just isn't there. And there's just so much good literature on this issue that is well worth reading.
Thanks, Guy. I think do we need God is exactly the conversation that Neville was trying to avoid, and we could actually we could have a whole discussion on that. Okay, that sums up the student questions on the process of evolution itself. We were next going to go into bringing humans in and how humans arose, but I'm aware that we're going to lose Guy shortly, and Guy is the climate change specialist. So I'm going to confuse things a little bit by just skipping forward. So we were going to bring in humans and then look at how the population of humans has increased and the problems that's brought, and then specifically focus down on one of those problems, climate change. We're going to just take a step forward, do climate change, and then we're going to come back to evolution and doing that sequence. So we're going to do a little bit out. It's going to be like Pulp Fiction for those who remember movies of the 90s, and therefore probably better. So I'm just going to quickly skip
Well, I'm
forward.
going to ask Guy a question while you're looking for his, and that is, according to the President of the United States, climate change is a hoax. I thought I'd stir the pot since you stirred the pot.
You're jumping ahead in the questions once again, Neville. Okay, let's move ahead. There was one question almost on exactly that. So yeah, the president says that it's a hoax, and Prudence asks, I heard that there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether global warming is really real. Therefore, I'd like to know, is it real or occurring or not? To add one third observation before you answer, Guy, I read today that the word uncertainty appears on average 4 times per page in the IPCC report.
And quite rightly so. Used in the correct context. I mean, there's no doubt of the fact that global warming is happening, continues to happen. The trends are there. The trends are understood well. The drivers are well understood. The expectation is very, very clear. Decades of obfuscation have slowed down our response to the level now where it is actually going to be quite expensive to tackle this deal. Donald Trump actually, in a recent debate, denied that he had ever denied climate change, and said that in fact he believed in climate change. So we had the case of a Republican finally saying that he doesn't deny climate change anymore, despite having denied it in the past. It's one of the few bastions of climate change denial is the Republican Party, funded by Fox News and other weird right-wing extremist organizations who wish to perpetuate human slavery to the oil and coal industry, which is, frankly, appalling. So the evidence, in fact, even one of the leading companies, which is responsible for emissions, Exxon, uncovered its own evidence that climate change is real and due to humans in the 1990s and suppressed it. So we have an atrocious human rights issue actually evolving here. So when the IPCC uses uncertainty, what it's trying to do is indicate that the future is very uncertain. And we all know that it's extremely difficult to make projections about the future. The models of climate, particularly with regard to rainfall, are very uncertain. And therefore, it's very important to inform policymakers of this uncertainty so that we don't have a false impression of certainty. But of what we are certain is that the world is changing, that the temperatures have risen, and that we are the cause of it. There is almost zero wiggle room for that conclusion.
Thank you, Guy. That leads quite nicely onto the second. Firstly, actually, before I go on to the next question, Guy, we missed you in the introductions. Could you maybe just give us a bit of background to yourself and as to why you're an authority on such issues?
I started doing climate change and CO2 work in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So I've been in the game for more than 30 years. I'm a physiologist and an ecologist, and in the last few years I've been involved in policy discussion, debate, negotiation in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm an author for the IPCC, promoted by South Africa, and I've now semi-retired to be a professor of plant physiology at the University of Stellenbosch.
Nice one, thank you, Guy. So the second question on this comes from Vintry, who asks, what are the main activities done by humans that are leading to climate change?
The main one has been the digging up of coal and burning it for fuel, which the Brits started and invented and discovered back in the 1700s, which fueled a massive growth in economic wealth and well-being. Then the discovery of oil and how to use oil to fuel our economies, fuel our cars, fuel transport, added further impetus. There's also changes in land use. People chopping down forests is one of the issues. It's responsible for a good fraction of warming. Some people say up to 20%. Agriculture done in certain ways can emit certain greenhouse gases which are quite destructive. Yeah, I mean those are the main causes.
Okay, thank you, Guy. Coming on to Notando asked, is it possible that climate change would have occurred without the influence of humans? And Sinitemba asks about the relationship between climate variability and climate change. I think those are linked. Neville, do you want to start us off there?
Yes, I do. Just say the first question again.
The first one was around, is it possible that climate change would have happened without the influence of humans?
Okay. Well, what I wanted to say there was that climate change has happened many, many times in the history of this planet. Climates change in the paleo record. For example, we have ice ages, we have what they're called? Between ice ages are called?
Interglacial
periods. Yeah, interglacial periods. So climate has changed over the history of the planet continuously. I guess the question you're asking is, particularly to what we're experiencing now, would it have happened without humans? Well, unquestionably, ultimately, the climate will change and will have changed without humans. What humans are doing are becoming agents of change at the geological scale of change. By pumping the environment full of the atmosphere full of carbon dioxide, that has changed if you like, the chemistry of the atmosphere's dynamic. And so we're creating an agent of change to the current climate. So the answer technically is yes, the climate will change, but not in the way that it's changing now and at the rate at which it's changing with all the consequences. The difference between climate variability and climate change, Guy, you might want to add something. What I wanted to say just about, okay, well, you go ahead and I'll talk about variability and change.
I was just going to quickly say that without humans, we probably would have been heading into an ice age right now. So about 6,000 years ago, our current era was at its hottest, the Holocene thermal optimum, and things have been cooling down since then, until it looks like the invention of rice agriculture some 1,000 years ago by the Chinese, which emitted methane. There's some evidence that started to warm the atmosphere up. And then, of course, the fossil fuel emissions of the Industrial Revolution turned that around. So we were on our way to an ice age, which we have turned around. So without people, we would probably be heading towards an ice age. It would have been a disaster for civilization. We can't have a civilization in an ice age. It would be very, very difficult. So there's a down and an upside to the story. And it's about, the getting it just right, actually, which this is about more than, so not too high, not too hot, not too cold. Goldilocks kind of idea.
But the ice age was due to start, Guy, within a few thousand years, right? That's the order of uncertainty around it. Or was there evidence that it was starting already?
Well, we were cooling. We've been cooling since the Holocene, right? The Holocene thermal optimum 6,000 years ago. So you can see that cooling trend, very slight. And who knows when that would have fallen off a cliff. And because we know that the interface between an interglacial and a glacial is very quick. And it accelerates. As is the opposite. It's even quicker when it warms up, the feedbacks kick in. So yeah, it's quite difficult to say, but we can fairly certainly say that we probably have staved off the onset of an ice age for probably 1,000 years or more. And if we keep the atmosphere at the right level, we can eliminate ice ages, which would be a good thing.
Okay, thank you, Guy. Neville, can I get back to you?
Yeah.
Yep.
First of all, is the YouTube video flowing? Because mine's frozen. Just wanted to check.
Have you tried refreshing?
Yes, I want to ask the question. I just want to check. There are questions there which I'm going to get to. Okay, just quickly. Look, climate is not constant. Climate varies. Obviously, we know it varies between seasons, right, from winter to summer. That some winters are different to the previous winter, or some summers are different to previous summers. So we see changes within an envelope of variability. So climate varies over time. So I want you to think about this summer compared to last summer, compared to the summer before, compared to next summer, say, for example. So we get changes between seasons. And then, of course, we have this change from winter to summer. So all I wanted to illustrate there was that we have a varying climate or varying seasons within a particular envelope of maximum and minimum of that variability. So that's what I mean by variability. Things are not constant. Climate is never ideal, ideally exactly the same every season. But then we've got the change in that envelope's extreme. So we might see changes to the average, or we might see changes in the extremes of winter and summer. So then we can talk about climate changes. So the distinction is variability or changes within a particular range, or the long-term change, if you like. Finally, Carl, if you will allow me, I would want to answer one or two questions that came up on the chat line. Can I do that quickly?
Sure, yeah. Or at least.
Okay. Okay, I'll be very quick if I can.
I'm so sorry.
Guy has to leave.
Yeah. But I threw cat amongst the pigeons enough.
All right. Thank you very much, Guy.
Okay, very briefly, because they relate to each other, the one I want to address quickly. So it says, so if evolution is still in existence, is it possible for people to adapt in 100 years to come because of drastic climate change? So the question is, well, if climate is changing, why don't we just evolve into some organism that can adapt to that? And the short answer is that that isn't the time scale of evolution. The time scale of evolution is many, 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 many generations, which does not mean to say that we don't have the capacity for adaptation. We do have the capacity for some adaptation. So, for example, we can, and the difference between humans and most other species is that we can adapt our environment to suit us. That's why we have homes and heaters and refrigerators, so we can actually manipulate the environment around us. That's what distinguishes humans from other animals, which are dependent and responding directly to the environment. But in terms of our genetic evolution, no. It will take many, many, many generations before we can physiologically adapt. An example that came to mind very briefly is hemoglobin. So you know hemoglobin is the protein which carries blood. And there are different kinds of different varieties of hemoglobin in different human species. Those individuals that grow up or have been parts of generations that have lived in very high altitudes, the dissociation curve of oxygen from binding to hemoglobin is very different to those that live at sea level, for example. So there's an adaptation to different environmental conditions. And in that way, I suppose over generations, we can develop different genetic adaptations through mutation and through selective breeding to climate change. But ultimately, the answer is no, because the rate of evolution of our species, particularly with the dilution of the global genetic pool, the gene pool, is very unlikely to be on the same time scale, which is much faster for climate change. Which brings me to the next question here, which is, I'd like to know if we are the only intelligence that exists on Earth or in the universe. Well,
Neville,
yes.
Can you tell us who's asking the questions, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't really read that. Let me see if I can zoom in. This is Kumbuzile Mnisi asked the question. Is evolution, sorry, that's not the person. The person that asked that question was Sibusiso Fokwana. And the question about intelligence, simply put, it all depends on how you define intelligent, okay? In other words, if people are capable, if there are other organisms capable of rational thought and manipulation of the environment on Earth, I don't think there are, although of course there'll be a debate about what we define as intelligent. Of course, there are some organisms that do adapt the environment or their niches to suit them. And whether there's other intelligent life in the universe that we'll be able to recognize as intelligent life, I don't know. I think your guess is as good as mine. I'm sorry, I want to quickly just address one more very briefly, and this is from Kumbuzile, who asks, is evolution and the survival of the fittest the same thing? Or how they're related? Survival of the fittest and natural selection and having a selective advantage are the same thing. More like the more successful breeding of the fittest is the mechanism, not so much survival, but those that have the selective advantage to breed more so that that genetic genome can be spread throughout the population. So yes, they are similar, and if not the same concept. But let Wendy also come in here, please.
Wendy, you want to add to that?
Yeah. Survival of the fittest isn't wrong. I would say survival of the best adapted. So how well we adapt to an environment, relationship according to fittest.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Sorry about that. So with that, I think as we've lost Guy, and I know that Wendy is also having to leave us at some point, I'm going to bring us back to the topic of human evolution, and we'll revisit climate change a little bit later. So we're now looking not just generally on evolution, but we're going to focus in on human beings and start to think about how is it that human beings evolved. Siphelele asks, is the DNA extracted from early hominids similar to that of present humans? And looking at the fossil records and DNA testing, is it certain that all of our species, for example, apes and humans, all evolved from these early primates? Neville, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, I'll start. I'd like Wendy to come in on this, please. So the first problem we've got is that fossils are not organic. They are inorganic. The oldest fossils are representations, stone or mineral representations of the organic material that they were formed by. So we don't get DNA out of fossils. We only get DNA out of genetically preserved material. So a lot of the family tree of the human species is inferred from phenotypic features which are inferred from the fossils, the physical shape and size, and comparisons between the different fossil bones that have been found. However, there are some very old humans as well as some Neanderthal tissue, which is actually preserved organic material that has been found, that's not nearly as old as the Australopithecines and some of our common ancestors. They're much, much more recent examples of human or human-like species. And that's been fascinating. So I happen to know there's a South African woman by the name of Janet Kelso who lives in Germany now, and she works at the Max Planck Institute of whatever it's called. I think it's anthropological research or something. And they have been very, very privileged to get their hands on this tissue, this remains of this tissue, and been able to sequence the Neanderthal genome, or quite a big proportion of it, and compare that with modern humans. And the big news is that we seem to have interbred with Neanderthals. They disappeared. They were outcompeted, or they were absorbed in to the human population. And so there seems to be some Neanderthal DNA that's part of our DNA. But that's really the only bits of information we have from genetics. The rest of the information comes from the comparison, the morphological comparisons of different pre-human homonym species. But the fossil record is highly confused, and there's quite a lot of controversy because we don't have every bit of the story represented in the fossil record. I'm going to stop there and ask Wendy to take over from me.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Wendy. Also, Wendy, Neanderthals were better than us, right?
Better is a relative term. Different because of their environment. So they're bones and stronger, they're bigger brains. In their archaeological record that they had very specific behavioral characteristics that we don't see in other populations around the same time. So at between 300 and 100,000 years ago, the Neanderthals appear to have had some kind of language. They even have something like a musical instrument. They appear to have been burying their dead, which we don't see in that period of time. behaviorally. Getting back to the DNA testing, so yes, geneticists have been able to extract ancient DNA from Neanderthal bone. That is many thousands, which is fantastic. And they've been able to map genome, and they see that about 4% with Neanderthals. After that, we have found a group or a population called the Denisovans, which is from Siberia, and they seem to have about 6%. So we do see that archaic Homo of that time, or our ancestors, were intermingling with different population groups, and as Neville said, would have either wiped them out or completely absorbed them into our phenotypes. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that answer?
That's great. Thanks, Wendy. It leads us on quite nicely that you mentioned the time periods of several things, but Zanele asks, how do we know the time periods of these various artifacts and fossils?
Very lot. I can 2 or 3. Firstly, there's 2 different types. We have relative dating and absolute dating. So relative dating, strategic or deposit. So things that are more recent or younger than the things that are below. So we use that a lot, particularly in archaeology and paleoanthropology. We also dating methods. So these are chemical techniques that often use something like isotopic decay. For example, particularly when looking at fossil humans, which is part of the question, is in which those buried. And a pretty famous one is potassium argon dating, and we look at the ratio between the decay and the buildup of argon, and we're able to date fairly accurately those fossils within years. So that helps. For things that are a little more recent, we look at carbon dating. As you know,
We're losing you. Okay.
The ratio.
Carl?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. I can hear you now. Can you maybe try turning your video off? Your connection's gone very bad. At the top of the screen, you can turn the camera off. And we'll get your audio.
Is that a bit better?
That's a lot better. Could you please just start a couple of minutes back?
I was talking about radiocarbon dating, and that once we die, carbon-14 is not absorbed in the body enzyme. So the carbon-14, which is 5,730 years, able to assess the absolute age of an organic organism by looking at the ratio of decay between carbon-14 relative to its half-life. Able to date things, particularly that are less than 50. That's just a couple of examples that we use to assess the absolute and relative age of organic material.
Nice one.
I have a question for Wendy. I have a question for Wendy.
I hope you lost your video.
I know, because I wanted to save bandwidth.
I don't think it helped you. We can hear you fine. We could also see you fine. You're
Wendy, I
welcome
have
to
a
show
question
us
for you. My question to Wendy is, are modern humans genetically more closely related to Neanderthals than they are to chimpanzees? In other words, if Neanderthals were some sort of parallel or very close common ancestor, we had a close common ancestor, and yet I hear that we are 99% genetically similar to chimpanzees, for example, would you be able to say that we are more closely related to Neanderthals or to chimpanzees?
According to this new genetic data, breed with Neanderthals much more close to Neanderthals than we are to chimps, because humans are completely different biological species.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to press on. Samuel asks, what type of landscape has played a distinct role in the evolution of human traits? And I think that's a really nice question, because it links well into one of the main topics of the course, in that you'll remember from the lecture on paleoclimate that we had this very distinct climate change that happened from around 10 million years ago to around 3 million years ago, where the Earth cooled. And scientists believe that that cooling of the Earth coincided, or in fact precipitated, the formation of the Benguela current off the west coast of South Africa. And the Benguela current changed the climate of southern Africa significantly. So before the Benguela started, 10 million years ago, heading back towards the age of the dinosaurs, the west coast of South Africa was very similar to the east and covered in jungles. The start of the Benguela upwelling caused that west coast to dry up. So the warm ocean was a source of moisture, making rain on the continent. The cold ocean doesn't release its moisture. It causes the rain on the west coast to dry up, and that changes the west coast from jungles to the savannas that Africa is famous for today. And the traditional theory goes that it was that change that precipitated humans, or the Homo lineage, to make its one big defining feature that sets it apart from the other primates, or to evolve its defining feature. And obviously that defining feature that sets the Homo lineage apart has been up on 2 feet, freeing up the hands.
It looks like they've disappeared. Oh, you're back. You're back. Sorry.
Oh,
You're
hello,
back.
Neville. You were never gone that I know of.
No, you were gone.
Oh, sorry. So
Okay.
I'll just repeat that last bit. So the classic theory is that the formation of savannas that was resulting from this cooling of the Western Ocean off the coast of Africa resulted in Homo sapiens standing upright, ostensibly because swinging in trees is no longer useful. Standing on 2 arms gets you a better view. The idea that using our hands were now freed up, wasn't specifically the reason for it, but was an advantage, an unanticipated advantage of standing on 2 legs. But then Putty Collins asks, why do we start walking on 2 feet? Well, all of the other organisms, all of the other big mammals on the savannah didn't. Wendy? Are you still there?
From what you were saying, it actually fits right in, because of an environmental and climatic shift. Remember I said about 6 to 7 million years ago, so food sources were becoming more scarce. So coming down from the trees was a viable option for survival.
Is Wendy breaking up, or is it just on my side?
once
Wendy, we can't hear you again, I'm afraid. Do you want to maybe try logging out and logging in again? We'll take another question in the meantime.
I think proceed, yeah.
Assume that's a yes. Neville, I don't think your video affects Wendy's connection, so we can see you if you'd like to be seen. So to add to that, okay, that's beautiful. Thank you, Neville. To add to what Wendy was saying, the traditional theory has also been challenged with a new or a relatively newer theory, which is that actually standing upright was a byproduct of spending a lot of time in the water, which is referred to as the aquatic ape theory. And that would actually, the aquatic ape theory would help explain why the other animals on the savannah didn't also go with this standing upright, because it would then not be specifically an adaptation to the savannah. But interestingly, hi Wendy, do you want to give that a go again?
Have the
A very bad connection.
I'm afraid, Wendy, we can't hear you. We're gonna have to press on without. I'm afraid. Sorry, Wendy. We're getting one word here and there, but that's about it.
Oh, that's not good.
That's not good. Although we got "that's not good" beautifully, which is sort of tantalising a little bit of hope in us that maybe we can carry on. One last try.
You have to try connect another way, like maybe with another device.
Maybe with another device, or possibly through your phone's 3G might work. Okay, so for the time being, I'm going to switch you off, Wendy. Sorry. And so I'm going to press on to some questions that we had about the future of the human race. Lots of people. We had Sholofelo, Domisile, and Tatai, all asking similar questions. Are humans still evolving? And do you think we'll evolve into another species? Who wants to take that?
If there are no volunteers,
go for it, Neville.
Humans are still evolving. As I explained earlier, in order for a genetic mutation or some adaptation to become prevalent in a population, that population has to be isolated. Otherwise, it's bred out and it just dissipates into the gene pool. So the way in which humans are evolving is complex, and I think we're too much of a we're a very, very big population, global population now. So it's very difficult for genes to manifest. But there's one example that I heard recently, and that is that in the past, when women gave birth to children, there was no such thing as a cesarean birth, right, where they do the operation. So, so that meant that if the child was too big, for example, the child would not be born, and the mother and child would die. So that limited, the human evolution was limited by the pelvic bone size of the human. But now, because of cesarean sections, big babies can be born and can be viable. And so the genetic propensity to have a bigger birth size can be selected for, because you have a much stronger, much greater possibility of survival. So the introduction of surgery and the introduction of a cesarean birth actually selects for babies that are bigger because they're stronger babies. So that's one example of how humans might evolve, that we become more dependent on cesarean sections. But of course, that's not available to all humans, right? So it's across the human species that particular selective advantage is applied. So it's complex to try to answer how humans will evolve. It's very complicated. But the answer is that there definitely are selective pressures on humans to help us evolve in different ways.
But Neville, one of the big issues, you've just touched on it really, is the advent of modern medicine and its intervention in terms of curing diseases that would otherwise curtail,
be fatal,
the one line.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, again, the problem with it is that it's not ubiquitously applied across human species. Another very good example, a medical example, is sickle cell anemia, right? Now, people who have this disease called sickle cell anemia are people that have a mutation of some of their blood cells. I forget now if it's a red blood cell. It is a red blood cell. So the red blood cell has got a different shape. It looks like a sickle shape as opposed to a round donut shape. And those people have a one disadvantage because they are less fit than other people who don't have the disease. But because they have sickle cell anemia, it means that the parasite that causes malaria, the malaria parasite, cannot infect these people. So if you have a sickle cell anemia, you are immune to malaria. Advantage over people in a malaria area where malaria exists as a disease, people with sickle cell anemia are fitter, if you like, in evolutionary terms, than people that don't have the disease. So having the disease, the genetic mutation, is an advantage. So you see many, many more people with sickle cell anemia in malaria areas than people that live in areas where there's no malaria, where the advantage is lost. So in a sense, medical conditions and medical treatment indeed does confer an advantage. But remember, it's only those who are breeding. So living longer doesn't mean you're going to have more children. There are certain diseases, genetic diseases, which only manifest in people later in life. Okay? So that means you have your children, you pass on the gene, and then you get sick. So that gene persists in the population because it's passed on before you get sick. They don't even know they've got the disease. There's several diseases like that. Huntington's disease is an example. In Huntington's disease, people have children. It's a fatal disease, right? You die from this disease. Can't be treated unless they use genetic interventions. So once you've got the disease, you're going to die from this disease. But the problem is you don't know you've got the disease. It's diagnosed genetically by luck earlier on until after you've bred. Only until you've bred. So what I'm trying to say is that indeed medical help, medical interventions do prolong lives of people that would otherwise die. But in many cases, all they do is prolong life. They don't impact on how people breed. Of course, if medical interventions save children, then those children grow up to be adults and they breed, and so medical intervention has had an impact. But I think the point I want to make, try and articulate this a little bit better, is that social behavior and habits of people and choices we make are as much selective breeding agents as are pure environmental drivers. And culture affects that as well. So human evolution is far more complicated by virtue of culture and behavior and decisions and choices. So while we may evolve, that might all be neutralized by interbreeding and global social functions. Well, I haven't been very articulate there, but I hope you get my point.
Nice one. Thank you, Neville. The key thing is that with modern human populations, for something to be a selective pressure, it has to stop you having children. I think that was a nice one that came through with you earlier. I'm going to hopefully try and get back to Wendy while we still have her. Wendy, are you there?
I am here. I'm now on my phone. Can you hear me?
That sounds brilliant. Yes, we can hear you.
All right.
I'm aware that you're going to be using your data, so let's target questions to you. Can you take up where you left off? We were asking, why is it that humans adapted to the savannas by standing on 2 feet and maybe not other animals?
Yeah, I don't know how much you guys heard of that.
Not a lot. So you can start at the start.
The initial species, Sahelanthropus chodensis, is our earliest common ancestor that we know of, dated to between 6 and 7 million years ago. And as you mentioned, the environment started to change. We started losing tree cover, and this species came down from the trees, most likely in search for food. Now, because of this different environment, from a lush tree environment to something like a savanna environment, the species would have had to adapt. Therefore, using other elements, such as their hands, to forage for food, meaning they had to stand on their feet, what we call bipedalism. And this would have had a ripple effect. So the more these species were standing on their feet, the more ability they had to use their hands. So we see things like extended foraging for food, starting to make tools, starting to use implements to gain food, and at the same time strengthening those muscles and bones in the legs, enabling things like walking longer distances, investigating other resources, other geographic spaces. So they really are very much linked. Coming down from the trees, starting to use your hands, and bipedalism are all very much intertwined. That's
okay, but if it's such a good
summary of what I was saying.
If it's such a good adaptation to the savannas, why didn't lions and the rest all go for 2 legs?
Very simply is that these other animals didn't have the same, or didn't experience the same environmental stress as a species like Sahelanthropus chilensis. And there was no necessity for that.
Nice one. Okay, that's interesting.
I'd like to add to the previous question about why do you think we're still evolving as humans? And there's a very easy example for the students out there. How many have had their wisdom teeth removed? Okay, it's a very simple example to show that yes, humans are still evolving. Not only in the last 30,000 years do we have about 1,600 genes added to our genome that protect us from various diseases, very basic things like reduction in teeth. So those who have had to have their wisdom teeth removed, or those who are now born without wisdom teeth, you can put in inverted commas, are higher on the evolutionary scale.
But how is that
evolutionary adaptation?
But what's the evolutionary pressure to that? Does anybody die of their wisdom teeth?
It's not necessarily a pressure. It's more a mutation that has developed over time.
But why would it be favored? I mean, everybody who's had their wisdom teeth removed that I know of has still, well, most of them managed to find a partner and mate. I mean, some of them haven't, but I'm sure they might.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It would be because of changes in jaw structure. We have much smaller jaw. Our food has changed. We don't eat big pieces of meat that we caught, with our bare hands and rip the flesh off with our teeth. We buy things at the pick and pay that is highly processed. So we don't need these teeth anymore. And somewhere along the line, there was a mutation that created these smaller jaws with 4 less teeth, and that has transpired or been passed along throughout the population. And it's not throughout the whole population, it's a fairly small percentage.
Okay, I'm going to get your last questions in, Wendy, but I want to ask, Charles asks, so if this whole evolution story happened, we have a common ancestor with the apes, why are there millions of humans running around and millions of apes, but none of the common ancestor?
As we have changed, or as our ancestors evolved, the genetic traits and the phenotype started to change. Those older species were completely absorbed into the newer. So what we do find in the paleoanthropological record is there are a lot of species that overlap, and some of them become evolutionary dead ends, like Australopithecus robustus, for example. At about 1 million years ago, they just disappear, and we don't know why. Other forms, like Australopithecus africanus, which is a very famous South African species, also called Mrs. Ples, changed slowly over time into what we call Homo habilis. And then the Australopithecines disappear because they're completely absorbed into this new species. And that's how it happens, and we see those changes. And in between, we've got these small little branches that disappear, and we don't know why. There's still a lot of investigating to do in order to answer details of those kinds of questions.
Oh, Wendy, so another point that I think should be cleared is So when we talk about disappearance, don't we mean exactly that we find disappearance of genes when we sequence, not necessarily that the human beings themselves disappeared into thin air, but that when we follow the genome, we find that somewhere along the line it disappears, not that human beings or those particular type of species disappeared in a sense, but the genome disappeared.
Well, we don't have genomes for those species. They're too old. I mean, we can't extract DNA from them, so we don't actually know. But in terms of morphology, as in finding the bones in the ground, the few that we have found, finding the fossils, we can see that all of a sudden at a specific period of time, we don't find them anymore. So whether it's an extinction event or whether it's genetic inbreeding or something drastic, we just don't know.
Okay, great.
I was just wondering what role geographical isolation might have played.
Huge, particularly when you're looking in East Africa, formation of things like Rift Valley. We see geographic differentiation between, for example, East Africa and South Africa. Although Australopithecines tend to be similar, the ones in East Africa are more adapted to their environment, so they tend to have much bigger teeth, more robust faces, flatter snouts, adapted to that reed and bark environment. And in the south, you've got the same species, depending if you lump or split species, but their snouts aren't as pronounced because they're living in more of a savanna environment. Their teeth are also a bit smaller. So geographical variation is definitely visible in the record.
Okay, that's interesting, and that also it links quite nicely to the next set of questions. Neville, if you're going to be brief, we need to press on.
Just to say that, of course, the fossil record is full of ancestors of other species. It's not just human species, right? There are lots and lots of ancestral species of other that exist in the fossil record.
Okay, thank you. But that question of distribution brings us on quite nicely. There's lots and lots of questions we had from Lloyd, Azuan Shlawisi, Stephen, all asking in Lloyd's, he says Homo's evolved in Africa and then spread out. I presume he means the Homo lineage and not an insulting term for gay people, and spread out throughout the world. How do we all end up in those various areas given that the continents are in their current shape?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking you, Wendy.
Okay.
Well, we've got you.
Yeah. So what we know is that there were two radiations out of Africa of early species. The first is Homo erectus at around 1 million years ago, give or take. This species looks very much like us. They're tall, they've got strong leg muscles, and they walk north. So what we see is the spread of Homo erectus right up into North Africa, crossing over into what we call the Middle East today, and parts of Europe, and all the way into Indonesia. So we've got evidence of these population groups being mobile, but purely walking. We don't have boats and those kinds of things. So this takes a long time. It's not something that happens over a couple of months. It happens over thousands and thousands of years, over many, many generations. What we also see at about 250,000 years is a second migration of what we call archaic or anatomically modern humans. And these are the guys that populate the entire planet. Also walking north, crossing what we know as the Sahara Desert, which at the time was a savanna, into the Middle East, Europe, staying in Europe and becoming the populations that we know as Cro-Magnon, and ultimately forming new species like the Neanderthals, and moving into Asia, developing those species. Yeah, I think that's it.
That's really interesting. There's 2 points in a question I want to make. The point is that the crossing the Sahara is fascinating because it links to climate. And there's a regular Milankovitch cycle which changes the monsoon from India to Africa. And so we have monsoons in Africa, regular, I think it's 10,000 year periods. So 10,000 years ago, I think it's the perihelion that changes. We would have had heavy monsoon rain on the savannah, and it would have been, as you say, savannah, maybe even jungle at the time. Yeah. And then in 10,000 years later, it's back to, we're now at the maximum for savannah dryness. And so
there's wonderful rock art in the Sahara that shows pictures of giraffes and reed buck and antelope. It's wonderful. Yeah.
So it's a wonderful link between Milankovitch, paleoclimate, and anthropology, which is excellent. I had a question.
Mark, I was just going to ask a quick question. So obviously, the dispersal of ancient humans into the New World, Americas, and Australia is a much more recent occurrence, and it has to be dependent on boats, basically.
Correct. So we've got a crossing of the Bering Strait, which was probably about 25,000 years ago, because it was an ice tundra, so it could actually be crossed, where today you need a boat or a plane. So we've got modern human populations from Asia crossing over into the Americas around this time, and archaeologically we can show the migration of these people, and also morphologically the people's teeth from Asia match the Native American populations. So we know that these groups genetically were very similar. Thereafter populating North America, and then later moving down south, Mexico and South America. When we look at Asia, population started moving south towards Indonesia, Polynesia, and then into Australia, island hopping, so to speak. We think on boats of some kind, or rafts that would have been built, but also much more recent. I would stand corrected, but I think the dates for Australia are about 40,000.
Okay, nice one, thank you. Island hopping, I guess, makes it sound a lot more romantic than it actually was. That makes me feel like they should have had cocktails and sitting on the beach.
But that's fascinating.
Yeah, really interesting. Wendy, I'm going to trouble you for one more question before we let you go,
sure.
Please. I'm hoping that we can hear you beautifully now. And I'm hoping that those who can see us will notice that Basanda to my right has a considerably different hue and colour to me. And that difference inspired lots of the questions from Tessa Noluchayando, Iria, Nokasilati, all asking, how in terms of evolution can we explain the different races?
I'm always very glad when people ask this question, because I can correct a lot of myths. If we look at the planet, because of its shape and its relative angle and distance from the sun, we have different ultraviolet radiation that hits the Earth at different rates. And obviously, if you're close to the equator, the ultraviolet radiation, or UVR, it's just easier, is going to be a lot more strong or potent along the equator, and less so the more north or the more south you move. So what you need to know biologically about Homo, or early Homo, and us, is that our skin is a natural protective barrier against the sun. Now, there are a lot of functions that interplay. One, our body needs vitamin D, and vitamin D is absorbed through the skin from the sun. So we need that to survive. If you don't have enough vitamin B, you have all sorts of problems like kidney problems. It's been linked to things like asthma. You have bone development problems, so you get a disease that's called rickets, which you can all Google scarily later. Another aspect that we really need in our bodies is something called folic acid, or folate. And this is very important for reproduction, but it is very sensitive to UVR. And it is destroyed by UVR, along with all sorts of other things. So we get sunburn, we get cancer. So our skin really needs to protect us from UVR. So what we see is that along the equator, people have darker skin for exactly that reason. Your body produces something called melanin, which is what gives your skin its pigment. So along the equator, where the UVR is a lot more potent, you have darker skinned people because the dark skin protects against absorbing too much vitamin D and from protecting you from the destruction of folic acid. So very important so that we can reproduce successfully and that we have strong bones and can breathe properly, etc., etc. The more north you move, your skin color starts to degrade, what we call a clinal degradation. So we start getting fairer skinned people to the north and south as you move away from the equator, because one, you need to be able to absorb more vitamin D. So you can't be as dark skinned because the vitamin D won't penetrate the melanin. You also don't need to protect your folic acid as much. You need that vitamin D more. So we start seeing the skin pigmentation or the melanin reduce so that we can absorb some of that UV, which we so desperately need to survive. So you start getting fairer skinned people the more north and south from the equator you go. So race is a social function. It's not a real thing. It's actually a clinal variation of skin color due to your need for vitamin D and folate, which is basically
Just a quick question. I missed one earlier, and it's quite important to this. Somebody asked, I can't remember who it was, as to, do we know where Homo sapiens first arose? And then the follow-up to that would be then, so did we all start as having darker skin, and then those who moved north lose it, or was it vice versa?
So what we can tell from the record is, yes, Homo sapiens, or Homo erectus, and archaic Homo sapiens, and anatomically modern Homo sapiens seem to have arisen first in Africa, East and Southern Africa to be specific. There's a lot of investigation and a lot of fighting in the literature about exactly where, so we know that that happened. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
So the second part was, and you've answered it, is so therefore humans, Homo sapiens, started out having a darker skin pigment, and then those who migrated north gradually lost it.
Yeah, so there's a big interplay between hair and sweating and skin color that we see developing, particularly in these earlier species. So earlier we had full body hair and we had lighter skin because the hair would have protected you from the UV. But as we started walking on two legs or being bipedal, so we have the ability to walk faster and run. And if you're running, you're going to overheat with this full mat of body hair. So what we see happening is that we must have developed sweat glands, otherwise we'd be panting like dogs and other animals do, which we don't. So in order to cool down, we have developed sweat glands and we have moisture on the skin, but it needs contact with the air so that we can cool down. You won't have contact with the air if you have full body hair, thick fur, so to speak. So we see the loss of body hair, the development of things like sweat glands, the ability to run, so fully bipedal, and then because you've got no hair to protect you from UVA and UVB, we start having increased melanin, so darker skin.
Okay, that brings me, I'm going to keep you just one little bit longer. I was mentioning earlier, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, the aquatic ape hypothesis. One of the things they highlight is that actually women in Homo sapiens lost more hair than men, and yet they're not the ones running around. If it really was an adaptation to running around, you would expect men to have less hair, and that they highlight it as an adaptation to actually going in the water.
Yeah. There's no way to know which theory would be correct, because it'd be great if I had a time machine and I could just go back and look. But I think sexual selection needs to go in there as well. That selection for less hair, whether it's male or female, is going to be a choice, and it's going to affect the hairness or hairlessness of a particular group. I don't know that you can say it was specifically men or specifically women.
They have a really interesting case, though. I don't know if you saw there was a BBC two-part radio series. I think you can still get on their website. David Attenborough did a two-part on the case for the aquatic ape. Well worth a listen to everybody, in fact. Really recommend it. Wendy, I'm going to let you run away there, I think. You might want, there's one more human evolution question, which I'm going to put to Neville. You're welcome to hang around if you want, but I'm aware that you do have to go. So I'll thank you now, and if you still jump in later, that's fine. Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks.
Last one is Gustav wanted to know that we have this, about 70,000 years ago, we have this bottleneck in human evolution, where it appears that 100 to a few thousand humans were all that was left on the planet, and they were living around the Mossel Bay area. And Gustav asks, but how did they know everyone should go to the Mossel Bay area? Was there a common language? Did everybody around the world communicate somehow? Neville, do you want to go for that? You must unmute your microphone.
I can try. I don't know a lot about this particular aspect of things. But when I read the question, it reminded me of a story I heard about cattle in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape, in fact. And when cattle went missing and people went to look for them, they would usually find them in one particular region near a little town called Bedford. And the reason that the cattle would aggregate there, they would all go to this particular place, is because the particular qualities of the grass that grew in this area was of such high quality that ultimately the grass would draw those cattle in. It was better and better and better until they got to Bedford, and that's where they all accumulated. You wanted to find your cattle, that's where you'd go. So I'm reckoning that what might have caused aggregation of people to come to one area other than language, which may well have been a factor, would probably have been the conditions which would be most suitable to an easier life, or plentiful and easy access to food, for example. So I think those are the kinds of things that might explain aggregations of people if it wasn't simply because everybody else died, and this was the one place that where there were people, they remained habitable. So I guess there are lots of different theories as to why that might have been the case. Is that the whole question?
That's the whole question. I mean, I would put forward the everybody else died hypothesis. It wasn't like everybody got an email saying the climate's about to change, head to Mossel Bay, that's the safe place.
Right.
It was the climate changed and the rest of the humans died off. It would just, so it wasn't that there was a movement, it was actually that the rest died off. Although I suppose maybe some locally, but I don't think, you know, people in the UK got the memo and made a long walk down to Mossel Bay. It was, they will have died.
Fair enough. Carl, there are two questions on the line I want to just quickly
Go for
highlight, if I may. One is from Sibusiso again, and he asks, can we regard species that will evolve from humans as humans in the future?
That's a great question.
So the question is, you know, if you came back in say 2,000, 5,000 years time and they're still humans, and they've evolved from where we are today, will they still be humans? And that's a difficult question to answer, because the only way you can define that, well, again, it depends on what your definition is of a species. So there are different definitions and there are arguments about what is a species and what's not a species, or what's the definition of a species. If you use the traditional, can they breed and produce viable offspring? Well, you can't test that with future humans and current humans. Is there a genetic line that you can draw, that there's a certain amount of genetic difference that we can use to define them? Perhaps there is, and perhaps we will have evolved to that extent, to the point at which we can say, well, yes, there are different species. An example going in the other direction, if you like, I worked in abalone, perlemoen, for those that know what that is, and there are fossil species, fossil shells of abalone from, say, 2-3 million years ago, which they dig up with quite significant regularity on the west coast. And they are regarded as a different species. They're morphologically similar, but different enough. They're much bigger, for example. it's difficult to know whether that's genuinely a different species or whether there's been some change to the morphology of them, still be regarded as the same species, but nevertheless some morphological differences. So in a lineage where you draw the line between what is and may be a different species, is very difficult to answer. So that's the answer to that. And the second question was from Tessa.
Great question, man.
Yes. Tessa Mubaraki asks, Mr. and Mrs. Igboro from Nigeria, who I assume are black people, dark-skinned people, gave birth to a white baby. That's what her question, that's her statement. Mr. and Mrs. Igboro, Nigeria, gave birth to a white baby. I assume that's significant because they weren't white people. What is the scientific explanation in relation to adaptation? So,
Neville, it's down to you. Is it albinism?
Albinism, right?
Yeah.
Albinism is a condition where there's a genetic mutation which prevents a person from producing melanin. So even white people have melanin. It's just a question of how much melanin you have, okay, which distinguishes different skin tones. So assuming that this child was an albino child, born with a genetic mutation which disabled them from making melanin, that would explain the whiteness of the child. But there are others, actually. So there's degrees of melanization. And it happens the other way around, where two light-skinned people have a baby who is dark-skinned. There's a famous play about that, isn't there? A famous English story about a noble family whose seventh child was black. Child to become the heir. So he had to do away with the other 6 children in order for the 7th child to become the earl. It's some famous old legend. So it is possible, technically, it is possible that if there is the melanin producing gene in your lineage, that might become expressed in your child, so that 2 light-skinned people can have a dark-skinned baby. And I guess also feasible that genetically it's possible to produce a light-skinned child, light-skinned tone child from a dark-skinned parents. But in this case, without further information, my guess would be albinism.
Nice one. Thank you, Neville. I'm going to press on now in our model. I'm going to assume that humans have evolved and that we've added them to our model. When humans first evolved, they went for hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years without making any big impression on the planet. But within the last 2,000 years or so, something different happened, and human population has accelerated. And to tell us a bit about that, I'm going to have a quick summary from Basanda here.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Carl Palmer. The talk on human population is important in the model of a habitable planet because everything that we have learned up until now culminates to this. When we explain that increase in the human population has been exponential, along with that, you see increase in carbon dioxide. And when you listen to the talk on human population, you will meet a few concepts that I think I should explain a bit. Demography, subpopulation, and population. So a subpopulation, so the world has a population, the human population, but in different countries we've got subpopulations. And a lot of the times during that talk, there's a lot of reference to subpopulations because most of the events that are spoken of happen in subpopulations, but all of that affects the overall population. And this is possible because there is demography, which is the study of the human population and its characteristics. So I'm saying that this, what you have learned, culminates to this because the increase in population is modeled into the future, and we see that if the population continues to increase, then we should expect levels of carbon dioxide to also continue to increase. So questions come up, and you have to answer, what can we do about that, the fact that an increase in population affects the habitability of Earth? But also this talk creates a dichotomy in our model of the habitable planet, because all along we've been adding different layers, and all these layers have been having a positive forcing on our model. So they've been improving the habitability of Earth. But as soon as we add human beings, they do the opposite. So during that talk, you will see graphs where there is population increase, there is birth rate and death rate, and that is to bring the point that the reason why we can understand or we can model population growth into the future is because we understand these things like population growth and death. So you know that the Department of Home Affairs collects this data, and census data is also available to be able to model population growth into the future. And also that, when demographers study population growth, they can clearly outline the industrial period when population increased because of things like improvement in technology, followed by improvement in agriculture and so on. So when you listen to that talk, factors that influence increase in populations are outlined, but as well as factors that influence decline in populations like wars, natural disasters, and so forth are also outlined. So I will end there.
That's nice. Thank you, Basanda. We didn't get many questions on population, so I'm just going to go through them. It's going to take a few minutes. I'm going through them all pretty much. So that includes Tina, who asked, why are humans so annoying? I'm going to respond to that by saying, of the people I've met in my life, most of the best ones have been humans. There are annoying ones and there are non-annoying ones. So I don't know if anybody else has a comment. Neville seems quiet for once, so I'll press on. Philemon asks, why is population relevant to the environment? I think you touched on it, but just quickly to outline.
Yeah, I think the most important one is that in the environment, most resources can be regarded to be finite. So if you continue increasing the population without increasing the resources, so one would imagine that at some point the resources will run out. But before we get to that tipping point, it has also happened that other things would come up surprisingly, like increased carbon dioxide levels, pushing things to the other direction. So it is important because increase in populations will have an impact on the environment, and the environment is what the human beings depend on.
Nice. And you pointed out how modern medicine, and we had the demographic transition, right? That in pre-industrial countries, birth rates are high, but death rates are high. And then we have this period whereby modern medicine has dropped the death rate right to the bottom, and we've got this escalating population. But Callum asks, will the human population ever stabilize and decline? Would you want to start?
Stabilize, I don't know what stabilize means in this sense, but it continues to decline and increase. So if we find a cure to HIV and many other diseases, we'd expect it to continue increasing. But if we have more diseases and more effects like floods from climate change and so on, then we would expect it to also decrease and so on.
Neville, do you want to come in?
I was going to.
Okay. Mike?
Just to add to that point there, I think one of the big things about population is essentially birth control. So the predicted population for Earth in the future is going to level out at about 9 billion. And we know pretty well that as the education of women increases, their birth rate goes down, because it's financially much more viable if they only have 2 kids rather than 6 kids. And so it's quite well known that the better women are educated, the birth rate starts to decline.
Perfect, yeah. And so you would expect a stabilization, but not maybe necessarily a decline.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. Neville, do you need to add anything, or are you good? He looks good.
I wanted to say that when you look at the distribution of age in any population, and you talk about a population being stabilized, so my question would be, is it stabilization in that shape that the distribution is in all the different variables? in that population, or you mean stabilization in just terms of the number?
I was just in terms of total number.
Okay.
But I don't know when you interpret it.
Let me just jump in with that. I think that's a very important point that Basanda makes, because we have an aging population in some of the developed countries, for example. And we have a growing bubble of young people in other countries. So those are quite important demographies in terms of resources required. And then Basanda, I think, covered it very nicely, but I just want to emphasize the point, and I forget now who it is. Is it WWF or somebody who's sort of calculated the number of planet Earth worth of resources we need to sustain the population? And this red line, right? That we only got one planet's worth of resources, but the rate at which we're using up non-renewable resources is more than one planet. So we need more than one planet's worth of resources. So in other words, we're going to run out of resources soon, unless we use them more efficiently, or we find other ways of replacing them, or we reduce the demand on those resources.
And in particular, food resources and water.
Nice one, thank you, Neville and Mike. Leads us quite nicely into the next question, which Mashaba Menda asks, with the world under so much pressure in terms of resources, why would anybody think of trying to persuade people to have more children? It was one of the pro-natalist factors came up in the course. I suppose I'll start with one example, is that I know in America, very topical now, a lot of Republicans are worried about the fact that they won't elect another Republican government because Americans are not having enough kids, and the rate of immigration is exceeding the birth rates. And so a lot of Republicans are trying to persuade you to have more kids to keep America American. So there are reasons. I don't know if anybody else has one.
Sorry, you go, Basanda.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, I'll go. So what I want to say is that, well, it's not really that we would want them to increase, but we may not want them to decrease if we have, for example, a high death rate. If we have, for example, high death rate because of diseases and natural disasters, we don't want human beings to reduce the birth rate. So in a sense, it depends on the death rate. If the death rate is too high, then it's not very bad to have babies.
Neville, you want one last say?
Can you just repeat the question? I did have an idea.
I can. I just turned over the page. I was thinking about the next one.
Why would anybody
encourage people to have more kids?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not one for seeing the population grow. I don't think the population should be growing. I think we should be living within our means, unquestionably. But everybody has to have, that's one of the most important experiences of life. So we can't say don't have children. We're saying have children, but don't have too many children. Have a number of children that can be sustained, that we can sustain. I think for quality of life, that's really the approach we should take.
Okay,
my opinion.
I'm going to press on because we had only a few questions on that, and I'm aware that we're running out of time. I'm going to move back to climate change, which is obviously, when we're talking about human population, really right now one of the biggest problems that human population is creating. We all need energy, and currently the energy that we use is generally made from fossil fuels. We had Guy talk a little bit earlier, so I'm just going to pick up on some of your questions. The first one is from Ditiro, who asks, how does water vapor in our atmosphere contribute to global warming? We're going to turn to Mike for most of these. So, Mike.
Okay, well, water vapor, oddly enough, is a greenhouse gas, just like carbon dioxide. And so incoming solar radiation reaches Earth in the short wavelengths, and re-radiated heat from the Earth is in the long wave radiation wave bands. Now, both carbon dioxide and water vapor are greenhouse gases, but what makes water vapor a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is that water vapor re-radiates infrared radiation back to the Earth in a greater quantity than carbon dioxide. In other words, less re-radiated heat escapes into space with water vapor than is the case with carbon dioxide. And then another variable on top of that is that the amount of water vapor in the Earth's atmosphere is quite variable, and it varies from about 1 to 3%. Now, curiously enough, climate modelers don't include water vapor in their climate change models due to anthropogenic greenhouse gases. They treat it as a separate issue because it's not man-made.
That's a fascinating interaction, actually, because you've got the man-made climate change is actually dwarfed by the extent of the global warming, the greenhouse gas effect of water, right?
Yeah.
But of course, water is there naturally. But then there's also the interaction that a warmer planet would mean more water vapor evaporating from the oceans. That is incorporated, well, they try to incorporate in the models, right?
I mean, the big thing there is, and it's a fascinating dichotomy, really, because as you warm up the oceans, you increase evaporation. If you increase evaporation, the warm air rises, you get cooling and condensation and cloud formation. And clouds at low altitudes have a very strong albedo effect, and they act to cool the planet by reflecting heat back into the atmosphere, back into space. Oddly enough, clouds at a very high altitude in the stratosphere have a warming effect. Now, the curiosity is that if you warm the oceans and create more clouds, which has a cooling effect, that should feed back to the oceans and cool the oceans and give you less evaporation and therefore less clouds. So you have this quite complex feedback loop between warming of the oceans, evaporation, condensation, rainfall, and cooling, and the balance of that is pretty difficult to model. And in fact, clouds are one of the biggest unknowns in any of the climate change models.
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting one. And we looked at in the course the idea of parameterization, right, of how in models you gain the average effect of something. And with clouds, it's almost impossible, just the sheer variety of different shapes and sizes of clouds. And this balance between water being a greenhouse gas, clouds cooling the planet, very, very difficult to model. And I think the amount of greenhouse warming per unit of CO2 that they have to add on is a lot more than just for the CO2, because they take into account this effect of water. But this could change in a changing planet.
Yes.
I'm going to take it as read. There's a couple of questions about the impacts of climate change, genetic loss, how it's going to make the planet uninhabitable. I think Guy did a reasonably good job of that. So I'd like to move on to, we had at Babes Wadumo on Twitter was questioning from the exam. She picked up on the question as to what do we mean by saying the oceans are becoming more sour? Why is that being put, was in the IPCC reports? And what exactly does that mean, and what are the implications?
I've read this question, and I'm presuming by sour, you mean that the oceans are changing in pH. Is that? Okay? So the idea here is a fairly straightforward one in some respects. As you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you simultaneously increase the amount of carbon dioxide that penetrates into the ocean, because the atmospheric CO2 is trying to stay in equilibrium with the carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the seawater. So you increase atmospheric CO2, you increase the amount of CO2 in the water. Now, carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. The chemistry there becomes a little bit more complicated, because the carbonic acid dissociates to form hydrogen ions and carbonate ions. And it's the hydrogen ions in the water that actually lower the pH. But the seawater is quite clever in some respects, because the carbonate in the seawater combines with some of those hydrogen ions to form bicarbonate. So the net effect of this chemical cycle in the oceans is that the carbonate concentration goes down, the hydrogen ion concentration goes up, which means that the pH decreases and the bicarbonate concentration increases slightly. And this is called the carbonate-bicarbonate buffering system. And so it slows down the rate of ocean acidification. And in some sense, that's also a misnomer, because the average pH of the oceans has been about 8.1 for the last 22,000 years. And it's kind of dropping down to around about 7.9 or thereabouts in some parts of the ocean. So it's still alkaline, it's not acid. But basically what's making the ocean sour is the increase in the hydrogen ion concentration, which lowers the pH.
That's a real problem for a lot of life.
Absolutely, because for calcifying organisms like most shellfish, they're making their shells out of calcium carbonate. But if the carbonate concentration in the oceans is decreasing, then it makes calcification difficult. And in fact, as you lower the pH, you tend towards dissolution of the shells rather than formation of the shells. Now, it's a particular problem for coral reefs and all sorts of calcifying organisms like abalone, which Neville is familiar with. And in fact, the abalone farmers of South Africa have been funding research into declining ocean pH because it's affecting the abalone aquaculture industry.
Okay, nice one, thank you. Moving on, Siphelele asks, moving back to the land, in fact, but as much as we need to plant trees to prevent climate change, is there nothing negative they do to induce or cause climate change? And I'm really sad that we didn't have Guy here for this one, because I know that he specifically did research on this, where he looks at, in South Africa specifically, actually planting trees is a bad thing for climate change. But Mike, did you have anything to add?
I don't know much about the impact of planting trees as being a bad idea for climate change in terms of CO2 removal, but one very good example where plants can be quite damaging in terms of greenhouse gas production is planting rice. Rice fields in Indonesia and China produce vast amounts of methane gas, and that's a greenhouse gas that's about 4 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. And we know that methane production causes a significant increase in global warming because it's such a strong greenhouse gas.
Basanda, did you know about Guy's work?
Yeah, I think I want to highlight something maybe related to the work that Guy does. I mean, I think he even mentioned this during the last talk, that, well, there is more carbon that can be sequestered in the soil than trees can do, to the point that even if you wiped out all of the trees on the surface of the earth, you will have very little impact on carbon dioxide. Although it's a positive thing that trees do, which is produce oxygen. But I think trees cannot be regarded as doing a bad thing, except that when the trees burn, a lot of aerosols go up to the atmosphere, and a lot of I think a lot of carbon-based gases can also come out from there, from the combustion of those trees.
I think Guy is a lot centered around albedo as well.
Yeah.
That actually trees are a lot darker than the African savannas, so they don't actually store more carbon, but they do actually make the planet warmer by making it darker.
Yeah.
Moving on to the effects quickly.
And maybe another thing is that they can, if they are, in a large enough scale, they can also influence climates in themselves. So it's another point to always remember, that if you have a larger number size of space with trees that are big enough, they can also influence the climate.
Well, one thing we know for sure is that of all the anthropogenic CO2 that's being produced, about 44% is being accumulated in the atmosphere. The oceans are taking up about 26%, and the rest is being taken up by the terrestrial biosphere. Now, the big question is, will the terrestrial biosphere and the marine biosphere continue to suck up carbon dioxide to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Now, unfortunately, the bottom line in both cases is that the terrestrial biosphere sink for CO2, in other words, how much it sucks up, is decreasing, and the amount of carbon dioxide that's being taken up by the oceans is also decreasing for slightly different reasons. Deforestation plays a big role in the reduction of the terrestrial biosphere to take up carbon dioxide, and it's a complicated story with the oceans, but basically as the oceans warm up and you have changes in the marine communities in the oceans, they are taking up less carbon dioxide than they used to.
Maybe another point that I just got reminded of by what you're saying is that, I mean, majority of the trees are sea tree, and majority of the grass, at least to this stage, is C4. And so what is the difference there is that C4 plants can actually take up more carbon dioxide than C3 plants. So, you know, it might also be that an increase in tree cover as opposed to grass cover would not encourage as much taking up of CO2 as opposed to an abundance of C4. So that is another point that perhaps, you know, with the decline in what terrestrial systems can take.
Yeah, I mean, this whole business about bush encroachment is another huge area of discussion that we probably don't have time to tackle right now, but it's a very interesting area.
So let's move on a little bit to thinking about Neville. Sorry,
I wanted to say something quickly. So Mike spoke about the oceans taking up carbon dioxide, but I just wanted to point out that the oceans are also taking up heat. So there's increased heat in the atmosphere or in the planet being trapped by the greenhouse effect. Where's that heat going? Some of it is causing global warming, as we know. And as we were discussing earlier, Carl, technically, theoretically, the planet should be a lot warmer than it currently is by virtue of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's not. Where's that heat going? Into the oceans. So the oceans are warming as well as absorbing carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
So that's another thing which is not limitless in terms of that. And that also has effect on the ocean chemistry. Then there were two quick questions on the chat line. One is from Dube, who asks, is there a direct correlation between climate change and population increase? And I would venture the answer to say there's an indirect relationship between population increase and climate change. There's a correlation. It isn't caused directly by the number of people, but it's by the burning of fossil fuels and the energy demands that come from an increased population. So there is a correlation, and as Basanda explained earlier, it's not entirely linear. It increased over time and when industrial revolution started. And then finally, he also notes ocean acidification with two smiley faces, and I take it, Kaitano, that means that that's something which you are unfamiliar with or somehow other sound incredulous about. And I just wanted to say in relation to that comment that I actually think acidification of the oceans is probably much more of a dangerous outcome of climate change, of global warming than changing climate. Ocean acidification has huge implications for us in many, many different ways, which Mike could possibly expand upon.
I think the other thing about ocean acidification, Neville, is it's one of the things that's happening that it's very difficult for climate change skeptics to refute climate change because of ocean acidification. The data are just far too solid for them to contest that.
Okay, all right, I have to press on, guys. I want to think about the effects of climate change and if it gets out of hand. One of the first ones I like, there's questions from Perseverance, who, I mean, climate change, we're often thinking about the worst things. Perseverance, though, asks, what's the region on Earth which will do the best, which will have the least severe effects out of climate change? Mike, I'll put that to you.
Well, the Okay, there are two things here. Climate change affects both the temperature and it has a big impact on rainfall. So just taking the South African perspective and talking about agricultural production, a country like Lesotho with a high altitude could actually benefit from climate change by being warmer and allowing crops to grow there more easily. So it's not a universal doom and gloom scenario.
There must be some regions that are going to win, but it's not actually least severe. They will actually win. They will be benefited. Maybe Siberia.
Yeah.
But that's a very important point you're raising. I want to just respond to that. You're right. Certainly, for example, in areas which are temperate now, which might be more kind of tropical in the future, sure, there are ways, there are potential advantages. Places where it has been dry now, it might become wetter, so you can grow crops. But the problem is our ability to adapt and the rate of change that is happening. So it's a question of learning how to change our lifestyle, how to change our productivity to adapt to those changes and take advantage of those opportunities. Of course, so there are both advantages and disadvantages, which, so that means that some, for example, might have to change crops, they might have to move house, they might have to do things to take advantage of what might be positive about changes to climate and the ecosystems associated with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And farmers are actually very good at adapting to change, providing they get given the right information early enough.
That's critical. I agree.
Also true. So, if we can't, I mean, if it does, we can't mitigate it. If we can't adapt, is it the end of the world as we know it, or is it just the end of humans as we know it? And that's Non-Kululeko asks.
I think as we mentioned before, that it's not what you call a general thing, that it will all be bad everywhere. In some areas it won't be bad, and one would assume that then those areas won't suffer, and if people are dying, then they might survive in those areas. Even
taken to its extreme.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to sort of turn back to the IPCC assessment on this. The current IPCC assessment of a year ago basically says that Earth's ecosystems can probably tolerate a 2-degree rise and a 2-degree centigrade rise and be able to adapt. But in a worst case scenario where the prediction is up towards a 5-degree change in temperature, ecosystems probably cannot adapt fast enough to cope with that rate of change. So the big problem is the uncertainty in the future, which really depends on what industry does, what the political will of countries is, and crucially, whether we have the courage to leave coal in the ground and move away from fossil fuels and move towards green energy. But that can't happen overnight. But the bottom line is we cannot afford to move from a 2-degree increase to a 5-degree increase.
Neville?
So can I just come in on that? So Mike, I want to emphasize a point Mike made. It's about the rate of change and how quickly the climate changes and what impact that will have. So the idea of, a post-apocalyptic world happening sometime, in the near future is a bit far-fetched, I would say. But the slow degrading of the environment due to climate change and plenty of other drivers. So it's not just climate change that is a threat to us. There are many other things, such as pollution, overpopulation, et cetera, which are also global change drivers. So if you combine those together, I don't foresee that the world will deteriorate into a sort of apocalyptic world by virtue of environmental damage and change. It certainly will stress our economies, it will stress people, it will stress populations, unquestionably. What I'm more concerned about is what will happen to society in response to those changes. I fear much more things like wars and other agents of disaster than I do direct environmental damage. So in other words, there are wars fought already. Some people argue that the whole war in Sudan is really a war about water, for example. And so there are battles that go on, if you like, about resources. But I think those issues, the political issues, as a consequence, an indirect consequence of climate change, are more threatening to society than being unable to go outside because it's so hot, for example. And I wanted to add one more thing about that. I just forgot. It's just out of my head. I think I'll come back to it if I remember.
And I think it's very important that you mention that, because although we're talking about climate change in a global sense, but the manifestations are quite localized. So rainfall or a flood is not going to happen all over the globe at once. It's going to happen in certain areas, and I think that will mean that our threats can shift, and those wars that Neville is talking about can actually arise.
I mean, if we just pick up on that rainfall issue very quickly, I mean, the predictions for Southern Africa is that the West is going to get wetter. Sorry, the West is going to get drier and the East is going to get wetter. The fact that you have more rainfall in the East doesn't necessarily mean you have more water available, because one of the predictions is that the rainfall will be so heavy that you'll lose most of it running off into the sea. So paradoxically, although the rainfall can be higher, you can still have drought.
Okay, guys, we have to move it on because we're running out of time. There's one or two really important issues I want to get through before closing. The first is both Alisiwe and Mbali ask about a topic which is referred to as geoengineering. The first asks, is it possible to build machines to somehow cool the planet? And Mbali asks, if it's possible to build machines to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So Mike, if you could, maybe just a little bit of an overview of, is that possible? Is it worthwhile? Should we do it?
Okay. The topic that Carl is referring to is what we call geoengineering. And the idea is, can we as a human race remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere artificially? And in some ways, that's a wild card that we would have to play, perhaps, if the politicians don't themselves decide to limit CO2 emissions. Now, the short answer is there are ways of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There's what's called carbon capture and storage, where, for example, a coal-fired power station can put CO2 scrubbers, they're called, in the stacks, and they chemically remove the carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide can then be buried underground in geological fault lines that are secure, and the carbon can be stored there. And in fact, there's already a pilot station in Norway that's capturing about 1 million tons of CO2 and burying it deep beneath the North Sea. So yes, that can be done. The other way of controlling climate is to control the amount of clouds in the atmosphere. And this is basically feasible. It's feasible to form more clouds by introducing what are called cloud condensation nuclei. And this effectively means adding sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere. Now, that's exactly what volcanoes do. So when volcanic eruptions occur, they spew out sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere, and you get a cooling effect. Now, the problem with that is that it's a uniform cooling effect. So some countries that don't really want to be cooled down get cooled down, and it's not a very specific, you can't control where the warming or cooling effect is going to take place because your cloud formation is too dispersed.
And who pays compensation if somebody's crops fail or somebody floods?
Yeah, all of those sorts of things. And there was a few years ago an idea of fertilizing the oceans with iron to increase the amount of CO2 that was taken out of the atmosphere. That does work, but as with a lot of geoengineering solutions, it can create more problems than it solves. So, for example, with the iron fertilization story, if you pump more carbon dioxide into the ocean, you increase ocean acidification, and that's a much more serious effect than the increase in carbon dioxide.
Nice one. Thank you, Mike. That was a really nice summary and I think succinct. Neville, you normally have something to add? Anything?
Well, I remember what point I wanted to make earlier, if I could quickly make it.
Very quickly.
Okay, there was simply that at the moment, the way our world works is that our economies are dependent on producing waste. And so the more the economy grows, the more waste we produce and the more carbon dioxide we burn. One of the solutions is to try to decouple economic development from the production of waste in broader terms, okay? Become less dependent on dirty fuels, for example, and so the development of our society can continue in a much more sustainable way. And that's one of the sort of economic approaches to this problem. I just want to add that point.
Nice, thanks, Neville. I'm going to finish this section, and we're nearly to the end of today. We'll be done in 5 or 10 minutes maximum, with one question that I again got from Twitter earlier on. Someone called @TheRealNicky, apparently from America, watching, listening in today, which is excellent, asked for more information about the Jevons rebound. And Nikki, that's a great question. I'll very quickly go through it because I think it's a really important topic. So Jevons was an industrialist in the UK in the late 1800s who noted a really peculiar effect, which is very important when it comes to trying and solving climate change. It's often referred to as the Jevons paradox. And that's that in his lifetime, he looked at the amount of coal that steelworks were using. And he realized that in his lifetime of about 40 years, steelworks had got 10 times more efficient at using coal. So i.e., for every ton of steel they produced, they were now needing to use 1/10 of the coal that they used to. But he noted a really interesting correlation. That at first you would expect that the more efficient use of the coal would mean less was being used. But actually, over that 40-year period that he'd looked at it, he found that at the end of the 40 years, they were now using twice as much coal. Why is that? Because they're now making more steel. The fact that they were making it more efficiently meant that the price of steel dropped. And that meant that more people wanted to buy more steel for more applications. So instead of making window frames from wood, people would switch to steel because it was now cheaper than wood. So he made the statement, and he put it in very flamboyant language, but basically to point out that we initially think that being more efficient at something will mean that we use less of that thing, where in general, in fact, the reverse is true. The more efficient use of a resource tends to result in more of it being consumed. And this is a real problem when it comes to reducing carbon emissions, because lots of countries are arguing that actually we don't need to cap carbon emissions. We can just enshrine efficiency increases in legislation. But of course, if Jevons is to be believed, that won't work. There's all sorts of other examples. For example, street lighting. As street lights have become more and more efficient, we actually used greater percentage of our electricity on street lights. Why? Because as they become more efficient, more streetlights get put in and the total increases, etc. So a really, really interesting effect. I'm going to close on climate change and move to our last, which is going to be a very brief topic. The last topic in the course was sustainable development, but it really is just a facet of lots of the things we've been looking at now, and we've covered most of it, because really sustainable development is looking at the mechanisms we can use to deal with the pressures that human population and climate change are putting on the environment. And we come up with these concepts, the ecological and the carbon footprint, and those are two of the big things that are dealt with. So I'm not really going to go into any real detail. I'm going to go for just one question from Godfrey, because I think that it really cuts to the heart of sustainable development. And Godfrey asks, what should we do to ensure that everybody is taking part in ensuring that our Earth is well preserved for future people. I'll start with Basanda, and I'll throw it open.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to be very short with this one because I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking human beings must just do nothing because they produce all of the waste and they create all of this unsustainable development and so on. So if human beings just don't do nothing, probably they will die. So it's not really a solution. But if they do nothing, then things will go well, I think.
Can I pick up on this one?
Yeah.
I think this is a really interesting topic because the whole issue here is, well, what are we going to do about climate change? Because often many of us feel fairly impotent about climate change and what we can do. But I think one of the things, or one of the traits of the human race, is that you might not worry too much about what happens to yourself, but you definitely worry about what happens to your children, and you certainly worry about what happens to your children's children. So on that basis alone, that should galvanize each of us to make a difference. Not necessarily for ourselves, but all of us invest a huge amount of effort in bringing up children, and we want to give them the best possible future. So I think the answer there is that people need to recognize that climate change is an issue that's going to affect our children more than it affects us, and therefore it's in a sense our duty to ensure that we minimize that impact for our children, if not for ourselves.
And maybe to just come back on a more thoughtful note, and to support that, like platforms like these, like talking about climate change and looking at it in a broader way and making the topic more available to everyone, actually, not just in a climate change IPCC discussion, but really here in a platform like this where everybody and anyone can engage and be part of the discussion will make a big impact, because to many people's surprise, very few people actually do know. We know very little, some of us still, but very few people know as much as we do about the topic. And people who are participating in this course have that opportunity, and this course will make a difference to some people's lives and will make a positive contribution to ensuring that, you know, we get there, something is done and the future is better.
That's brilliant, and we didn't pay him, honestly. Neville?
I just wanted to say, I want to just refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a very old philosophical concept, which talks about people's ability to worry or to concern themselves with more abstract concepts, the wealthier they are. In other words, if you're poor, your ability to concern yourself with the distant future is impaired by virtue of the fact that you have to survive. Survival is much more important than thinking about the future of the planet in 30, 50, 100 years' time. So you concern yourself with immediate problems like production of food or whatever the case is. So recognizing the fact that we need to raise our level of consciousness, one of the things we need to do is to address poverty. And I think the way in which we can get people free enough to be able to concern themselves with a philosophical concept of the future of the planet is to ensure that they aren't concerned with the survival today. And to do that, we have to address poverty. And so for me, sustainable development is critically involves fundamentally addressing poverty.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you,
I
Neville.
agree. Yeah.
Guys, I'm going to have to round off now because we've run out of time. I'm going to finish with asking everyone one question, and I'm going to press you. I want an answer in one sentence. Okay, this is a really difficult exercise in being concise. It was a question that we got in the very first week of Habitable Planet and haven't answered because partly it's the point of the course. But in the first week, Dumasile asked, why is the Earth habitable? So I'm going to give you each one sentence to close off on. Neville, you think fastest, so I'm going to head to you while you're up on the screen.
The Earth is habitable by humans because humans evolved in this particular environment. So that makes us perfectly adapted to life on this planet. We are not adapted to life on any other planet.
Perfect meta interpretation of the question. I appreciate that. Mike?
My answer to that would be essentially because this planet is the right distance from the sun, and early life evolved an atmosphere which originally was dominated by carbon dioxide, but then as oxygenic plants evolved, it produced an oxygen atmosphere of about 21%, and that's allowed life to flourish on Earth.
Yeah, life is habitable because of a combination of characteristics that Earth has. Earth is habitable because of a combination of characteristics that Earth has, and all those characteristics combined in their action make Earth habitable.
The big ones for me, it has to be the distance from the sun, the atmosphere, photosynthesis, definitely, and the recycling of stuff.
Yeah.
And that will do. Ladies and gentlemen, time is upon us. It's been a really interesting discussion. Was that Neville, you wanting to say something before we go? No, he's saying
that
bye.
was just a victory sign, wasn't
All
it?
right. It's been a wonderful course. This is the last time I'll engage with many of you out there face-to-face, so to speak. I'm looking forward to welcoming those who make it to Cape Town in 3 weeks' time. We'll see you all then. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good night.
Good night, everyone.